Something has been leaving strange meat in our fridge. I know that sounds weird. It is. And I say something instead of someone, because I don't think it's a person doing it. Look, my wife Maria and I moved into this house on 413 Rutherford Lane about a year ago. We got it for a steal, and at the time, I didn't question it. My wife was pregnant when we found the place, and with our budget, a 4-bedroom, 3.5 bath in a nice neighborhood was a godsend. I found out after the fact that a couple had lived there previously, and apparently, their son had gone missing. The father had broken his neck trying to open a door on the second floor from the outside, and the mother wanted to get as far away as possible. Well, that's what our neighbor Stephen told me anyway. Though, honestly, I doubt it would have changed our decision to buy. There's no door on the outside of the house on the second floor, by the way, so maybe Stephen had something confused. Anyway, the house is old, 1804, I think, and it still has a servant's kitchen in the basement. At some point, a previous owner had renovated and put a new kitchen in on the ground floor. But some of the servant's kitchen is still there. A few cabinets, a non-working sink, a cast iron wood-burning stove, and a refrigerator. Obviously the fridge isn't original. I don't know if the rest of it is either. But the stove at least looks like it belongs. The fridge is one of those 1950s fridges. Seafoam green with chrome accents and a handle that sticks sometimes. It's the kind of fridge I imagine a kid might get stuck in while playing hide and seek in a scary movie. Well, immediately a few things seemed off about that fridge. For one, as best I can tell, it's bolted to the floor. It looks heavy, sure, but I'm not exactly a small guy, and I couldn't budge it. Not an inch. The fridge works. I mean, it's cold inside like a fridge should be. But for the life of me, I can't see where it might be plugged in. None of these quirks deterred me from using it, of course. And to be honest, I didn't think about it much. Until the meat. Like I said, there's a proper kitchen on the first floor. And so the basement fridge became a repository for extras. Beer, wine, some produce if we overbought. Then, about a month into living there, I found our first package. It was sitting on the top shelf, a pristine brown paper parcel with a single piece of white tape holding it closed. It was innocuous enough, but my wife wasn't usually the one who stocked the fridge, so it piqued my curiosity. I still have a very vivid memory of picking it up, because I was at once disgusted and curious. The moment I touched it, the paper became wet, a dark, greasy splotch spreading across its surface. By the time I actually got it out of the fridge and set it on a table, it was dripping. The paper was almost completely soaked. That piece of tape was barely hanging on, curling away from the sodden paper, as if willing me to give it that last little nudge and reveal the contents. I did, and as I opened it, I saw a loose pile of meat, haphazard cuts of sinewy flesh in deep reds and browns with an oily iridescent sheen. The smell wasn't what I would have expected. The meat oozed with deep red blood and it smelled metallic. I know that blood has iron in it. I've sucked a paper cut before and gotten that metallic tang. But this smelled metallic, like metal filings almost. I put it in a bowl and back in the fridge as quickly as I could, but when I asked my wife about it, her response was, "What meat?" I certainly didn't put it there, but if she didn't either, well, we were the only ones in our house. I should have been more concerned in that moment. I see that now, but at the time, I rationalized. The meat must have been there before we moved in. I must have missed it somehow in an otherwise empty fridge. It didn't make sense, but the notion of someone sneaking into a house to leave meat in a basement kitchen was so far-fetched that it didn't occur to me. When I returned to the fridge barely 3 hours after first finding the package, I was in for another surprise. The bowl I had put the meat in no longer contained chunks, but rather a viscous, lumpy sludge. It was almost as though the meat had melted, and in my revulsion at the bloody slurry, I could have sworn that it shivered. I threw it out along with the bowl. I ended up throwing out the beer and wine too. I couldn't explain it, but everything else in that fridge had somehow taken on a raw, gamey flavor. And after I drank, my lips would end up with a distinctive film of something like cooked fat. That was that. I wouldn't use the fridge for a while, and as it happened, an unexpected bout of morning sickness in my wife distracted me enough that the meat in the fridge passed out of my mind. For a while. Maria's morning sickness turned into an edgy, emotional minefield, and while I tried to be sympathetic, the thing she seemed to desire most was space. I relocated my home office to the basement so I could give it to her during the day, at least. But being down there, I began to remember the fridge again. It was perhaps a month after the first package that I opened the fridge, and what I found inside wasn't another package, but 3 others. That sight would have made me uneasy enough. But while 2 of them were untouched and still held with identical strips of white tape, the third was open. I stared at it, utterly repulsed by what I saw. The meat was a mottled gray, with patches of mustardy yellow foam that bubbled up from puckered recesses in its surface and beneath it. On the paper writhed a blanket of pale white maggots. I threw all 3 of the packages away and scrubbed that fridge for the better part of an hour. I scrubbed, but I couldn't clean away what struck me as one of the most disturbing aspects of that foul lump of meat. There was a thick bone protruding from it, and on its surface, I saw what looked like the scrapes and indentations of human teeth. With that, the scenario finally sunk in and began to twist into horrific possibilities in my mind. Someone was coming into our house and leaving meat in our fridge. No, storing meat in our fridge. And whatever that meat came from, that someone was eating it. It didn't take long before I began to consider the possibility that whomever it was, they might not be leaving right away.
Maria!
I shouted as I ran up the stairs.
Marie!
What is it, honey? She answered from the living room sofa, a picture of serenity compared to my sudden mania. She looked so peaceful, even as she wrinkled her forehead at my distress. I wanted to tell her, to warn her, but she was so tightly wound, even when she didn't look it. The doctor had told her to avoid stress, and telling her about a stranger sneaking into our house wouldn't help at all. I decided to lie. With the baby coming, I'm just worried. I just want us all to be as safe as possible. All right, Maria? All right. Maria said that changing the locks was a lot of worry over nothing. But eventually she relented. She didn't have to know about my nighttime sweeps of the house, checking windows and cupboards and closets. She didn't have to know anything. But something about the next couple of weeks told me that she did. She started sweating in her sleep, mumbling to herself as she was drifting off. I must have checked the fridge a half-dozen times a day for a while. But even as I saw nothing there and hid my protective efforts, I could see that something was getting to her. Perhaps she could read it on my face. Perhaps she just felt the ominous air that followed my efforts. I thought a lot of things, but never the right thing. I had considered talking to her about it and even tried a few times. but she would get irritated a few words into the conversation. A few words more and she would turn to shouting or crying, saying that I didn't care about her, that I never loved her, and that I had no idea what she was going through. She was wrong about most of it, but not about the last bit. I could read a dozen pregnancy blogs and books, but ultimately I wouldn't understand her struggle. Her belly swelled with a child that would change everything about our lives. Maria was just changing with it. I wasn't helping things with my increasing paranoia. The doors were locked, the windows too. I bought alarms, and after my third sweep of every inch of the house and a dozen other redundant precautions, I knew that whomever had been in our house was gone. Finally, I decided to just be there for her. I reasoned that the best way to protect her was by ensuring that I was present, not by endlessly checking to see that someone else was absent. I moved my home office back upstairs and left the basement alone. I gave her space when she wanted it, and I was there when she wanted me. She seemed happier. We were safe. We were safe. We were safe. I had reassured myself of the comforting notion so many times that I almost believed it. All logic and reason told me that we were. But we weren't. In the coming months, Maria seemed perpetually on the brink of fatigue. But she seemed better, warmer, less agitated. We joked, laughed, and mused about what our son would be like. I even began to forget about our unseen guest and our basement deliveries. Although habit still drew my eye to every lock and window before we would turn in each night. We were safe. I awoke to the sound of screaming in the middle of the night, a week before Maria's due date. She wasn't in bed.
Maria!
I followed the sound of her agonizing shrieks as I bounded down the stairs. But as I reached the first floor, her screams stopped as abruptly as they had begun. Where was she? I flung myself around corners, through doorways, and into rooms, searching, desperate. My calls of her name were met with silence, a silence that I filled with a hectic jumble of horrible possibilities. The baby, a stranger.
Maria!
She wasn't there. Basement. I skipped steps as I bolted into the darkness. I wish I hadn't turned on the light. She was there, in the old kitchen, her body lying on the floor. My knees buckled, cold sweat beating on my skin as I stared in sickened disbelief. She was lying next to the fridge, but only the top half of her. The way everything stretched told me where the rest of her must have been. Her legs, her belly, our child. The fridge. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in the sight of my mangled wife and her face that seemed frozen in a silent scream. I left. I slumped onto the sofa in the living room, and some unknowable time later, I remembered something. My paranoia, my precautions, my attempt to make us safe. I had installed a motion-activated camera in the basement, pointed right at the fridge. I had just never checked it. When I opened my laptop, I knew where I had to stop, where my stomach would make me stop. I couldn't watch those last moments, but I had to know something about what had happened. What I found on those recordings were unexpected. I had been avoiding the basement, but every night for weeks, there were recordings, all of them time-stamped at exactly 4:13 a.m. It was Maria. She would wander into the basement, walk the same path to the refrigerator door, open it, and pull out a package. All the videos were the same. Maria stood at the table and tore into chunks of that disgusting meat until it was finished, and then she would neatly fold the paper and place it back in the fridge. She must have cleaned up elsewhere, because in every video her hands and mouth were dark with blood when she finished. I stopped watching the entire videos after the first few. The sight of her gorging herself on that meat was too nauseating to repeat. Still, there was one thing I noticed in the way she moved. Her arms were always limp as she walked, and she seemed to stare off as she ate. I'm not certain, but I hope, she was sleepwalking. I sat for a while with my cursor hovering over the final video, but I clicked eventually. It started the same as the rest. She took out the package, she ate, but instead of folding the paper afterwards, she laid in on the ground in front of the fridge and took off her shorts. As I watched, a voice in the back of my mind screamed for me to turn off the video, but my hand wouldn't listen. I watched her give birth on that floor, but what came out of her was horrid and deformed. All of its eyes blinking out of sync as its arms and legs twisted and bent at inhuman places. I was paralyzed watching what should have been my son latch its mouth onto Maria's leg. And then I saw a long hand emerge from the fridge to claim it. The video cut to static as Maria roused from what I assumed to be sleep and started to scream. I think I'm glad for that. I don't think I could bear to watch her end, and I don't know if I could have stopped myself. The meat, I don't know what it is, but I know what it did to Maria. The night sweats, the agitation, and the fighting, I thought it was all part of the pregnancy, of her receptiveness to my paranoia. But she got that way when I was checking that fridge constantly. I think whatever brought that meat to her didn't like being looked for. And I think that what Maria was experiencing was withdrawal. That fridge fed her for months, and in the end, whatever is inside of it felt owed. Whatever the truth is, I am doing everything I can to avoid knowing it. I should have called the police. I should have tried to recover what remained of the woman I loved. I should have, but I cannot cope with what is at the bottom of those stairs. So, instead I wrote, hoping that madness committed to paper will leave my mind alone. Still, I know she's there. She's been there so long. A scientist pines away years waiting to receive a message from the future, not knowing what comes with it. Dr. Stephen Malta sat on the cold bench, laying cards on the cold table. He had long ago grown accustomed to the smell of the dust, oil, and paint of this building. Beside him, the computer ticked and hummed away as it moved through 10,000 configurations per second. Each was tested in real time on the pillar, taking up most of the center chamber of the decommissioned nuclear missile silo. Morning greetings of birds carried down the hole nestled in the deep forest of North Dakota. The blue glow of the massive column did more to light the room than the government-issued, lowest bidder fluorescent lights hanging above him. The flickering was far too fast for the human eye to see, and the pillar instead seemed to pulse softly as it rode the pattern of its configuration schedule. It breathed, like a sleeping titan. He was not ashamed to admit he cried the first time he saw it. It had filled him with the awe of the scale of the immeasurable. The pillar had inspired nothing less than the fear of God. Not the God of Abraham, but the God of Einstein, Franklin, Sagan, and Culver. With this tool, man might weave the universe anew. He now looked at the pillar without expression or emotion. He sipped his coffee, He drifted to his favorite way of making the time pass by, through the monotonous days and nights of babysitting this machine. Other members of his old research cohort had been accepted to the Martian terraforming project. They had told him in a video chat, and he feigned the elation for them he knew they were after. He had always enjoyed being alone, but the world has its way of correcting extremes in the young and naive. The river leaves us all as polished stones, all the points rubbed away. He had only recently admitted to himself this dulling of his passion was due to loneliness. He had asked to be rotated out to other assignments, but his own expertise was his undoing. He was the only human alive that was willing to work for the Nero nations, at least, who understood enough to keep this machine running. The concept was simple enough. If configured correctly, it would be a beacon, a grabbing point that some sufficiently advanced future technology could use to send signals back in time and appear right here, right now, on his computer. He had laid the highway and waited for the traffic. Build it and they will come. The complexity came in the configuration of that signal. The cosmic background radiation was both key and a hindrance to the calculation. The solution was in this room, just somewhere in the 9 trillion fractal generated solutions the computer was working through, chunk by chunk. He had been in this room, tweaking the configurations, checking for solutions and errors in transcription each hour for the past 6 months. If his predictions were correct, this would take an average of 3 years to find one of the 4 possible configurations, but up to 30 if they were unlucky, or never if he had made some mistake early in his calculations and was just barreling down a road to nowhere, off the cliff of irrelevance. He knew this couldn't be true, but the fear still came to him in fitful moments before sleep. The sensor behind him clicked, once, twice, and a third time. This happened once every other day or so. The computer was alerting him to an abnormal reading, usually indicating a resonance in the 0.5 to 1% range from the chamber of the pillar. Each click indicates a factor of confidence in the connection to the yet-to-be-named highway of time. He sipped his coffee and the computer stopped humming. It had moved to a slower QCPU cycle, stopping its search through configurations. The pillar ceased its pulsing, glowing with consistent light. He groaned. He would have to take the system apart piece by piece and figure out what had stopped it. The sensor clicked again. He silenced himself, listening hard. Another click came, and another. By the time he dropped his mug to shatter on the floor and ran to the display, the sensor had clicked 14 more times. The display showed a 74% connection. A reading of 1.4% was the highest he had seen before this. He immediately got to work adjusting various sensors and directors. He was both horrified and delighted to realize an entire inner rod had not been synchronized with the others. If the signal hadn't been so strong, he would have missed it. He cursed his sloppiness as he adjusted the rod's alignment and returned to the display. It now read 99.6%. He collapsed, uncertain if the bench was behind him or not. He luckily fell back onto it. That level of connection meant not only the computer had found a viable solution configuration, but the pillar was receiving a signal. Just like that, instant contact. They were waiting for him. A signal from some future device, projecting into that unknown and pinging here, in what would to them be the distant past. He looked at the display again. It read 99.98% connection. He looked at the raw data pouting across the screen. The scroll bar shrank to a sliver. He sent the text through the computer's analytic engine, but it couldn't make sense, only recognizing vague patterns of protein sequences. Likely a coincidence. He struggled to begin broadcasting the signal directly to HQ in Toronto. No one was responding. He looked at his watch and realized it was just before 7 a.m. The greatest single scientific breakthrough of the century, and he would have to wait for his handlers to wake up and drive to work. He threw a clipboard across the room in half elation, half frustration. At some point, he had started laughing.
Hello?
A voice came from behind him, silencing him.
Would you let me out? I imagine if I can see the radiation, it's not a safe place to stand.
Stephen turned slowly towards the pillar, the source of the voice. Inside the reaction vessel itself, wearing a small face mask and a gray robe, was a woman. Stephen immediately pressed the emergency shutoff button, and the gentle hum of the pillar cut off abruptly. He flicked on more of the fluorescent lights. The pillar was black now, glossy in the reflections of the lights. He had never seen it powered down before. It struck him as ominous.
On this side here, there's a sally port with a decontamination chamber. Pull that lever there and open the door.
Stephen spoke to the woman through an intercom. Rather unnecessarily, he realized, as his voice carried far in this quiet place. The woman did as he said and entered the chamber. He started the decontamination procedure as violet lights worked their way across her.
That will buy us some time to talk, I suppose. The preflection should take some time since you stopped it so soon. I wonder if you always do that.
She said, looking at the pillar.
How long will this decontamination take?
About 2 minutes.
Stephen replied.
How did you get in there?
I came over.
She said, gesturing up and down the pillar.
The Strait of Malta.
You came over.
He said.
You mean you traveled from the future through the connection I established with the pillar there? How?
To be completely honest, I'm not sure. I'm not a scientist. I just know the projector works. This is the earliest connection, and each of us travelers arrives in our own fresh copy of it, alone. Many choose to come through this off-ramp and meet some version of you.
The woman said, waiting for the outer doors to open. Her eyes followed the curving ladder of the silo.
We're underground then?
She sounded worried.
Yes, we are in the Celadon 47 research facility, built out of a decommissioned American missile silo. We don't have to take the stairs. There's an elevator right over here.
The decontamination procedure finished and he released the lock. The door opened slowly as the woman pushed by it and walked towards the elevator. She coughed and laughed to herself, pulling down her mask as she did. She was an older-looking woman, strikingly beautiful. Thin, branching metal lines separated the nape of her neck. Stephen helped her with the button and they entered the elevator.
So, this is so much to take in. I can't imagine where to begin. What year are you from?
I don't know how exactly your calendar relates to mine, but this event is tens of thousands of years in the past from my perspective.
The woman said, distracted by the fabric of his lab coat, rubbing it between her fingers.
Tens of thousands. That's staggering to imagine. Did your people only recently discover the technology you used to come here?
He asked as the elevator dinged and opened, revealing the basement of the cottage that covered the silo. She pointed towards the stairs and the door leading to the ground floor. He nodded and watched her scurry up the stairs and fumble with the lock for a moment before opening the door. He jogged to catch up with her. She had broken a window in the mock kitchen and was already in the field behind the house, staring at the sunrise. He used the door to get outside and stood beside her in the field. She had fallen to her knees and was crying. She had fresh red cuts up her arms and face.
Why are you in such a hurry? You have all the time you need. Whatever you want to see before you return to your people, we will show you.
He said, kneeling beside her.
It's a one-way trip this far back. Humans won't have anything to send me home for a very long time.
She said, wiping her eyes, not looking away from the sky.
Is that why you were the only one to come over? That's a great sacrifice, I'm sure.
Stephen said.
No. Plenty of people choose to go back before we built the on-ramps. I don't have long left. Regardless, I'd rather go out seeing this. You have no idea how lucky you've been to be here. In this time. In this place. Seeing this, if only for a few moments, is well worth the ticket price.
What price? What do you mean?
Here, sit with me.
She gestured beside herself, and he obliged.
As I said, I'm not a scientist, so I can't explain this well, but I'll try. That machine down there is built wrong somehow. You couldn't have known, but you didn't account for something called reflection. It affects gravity and spreads its effect out across matter. Your machine activating back there will destroy the Earth.
What?
Stephen screamed, standing.
How long do we have? How can we stop it?
Any minute now. And there's nothing to be done. As I said, you stopped the reaction quickly when you saw me. That's the only reason it hasn't happened yet, I'm guessing.
She said, breathing deeply.
Then why did you come back? If you knew you were signing your death warrant, why come here?
Stephen screamed again, wanting to return to the lab but not sure what he could do. The pillar was already off. He stayed beside the woman. He saw trees in the distance begin to fall over in groups as the birds scattered.
I grew up reading and hearing about the planet we all came from. I saw poor resolution pictures and videos, but nothing like really being here. I chose, as many have, to travel to this earliest off-ramp and live the last few minutes of the planet where humanity was created. I'm glad it was a sunrise.
Stephen turned in time to see the woman smile. He tried to grab her for support as the ground beneath him began to sink, but she sank as well. He lost his footing and tumbled back. No ground rose up to meet him. The sky compressed into a thin point of light. He heard a click, another, and then all was black. My name is Michael. I'm an independent contractor for construction work. You have to help me. 5 days ago, I woke up to complete and total darkness. At first, I thought nothing of it, figuring I had simply awoken in the middle of the night. I rolled over, squinting through groggy eyes at the digital clock on my bedside. 10:13 a.m. What the hell? I sat up, confusion slowly draining the remains of dreams from my brain. My apartment is on the east corner of an apartment complex. I hadn't set an alarm, this being one of my few days off from work. But the rising sun should have woken me long ago, bleeding through the thick curtains. My hands fumbled blindly around the bedside table, searching for my phone. The darkness was smothering, all-encompassing. Living in a city, you're always inundated by light. The glow of traffic, streetlights, other houses. But somehow, my room was pitch black. Finally, my seeking hands found their mark. I raised my phone, turned on the flashlight, and panned it around the room. Everything was cast in sharp contrast, the edges of shadows jagged and precise. I got up out of bed, walked over to the window, and threw the curtains aside. Stone. From top to bottom, my window was filled with gray, featureless concrete. It was smooth but solid and set, as if it had been there for days. Is it strange I didn't panic? I don't think so. This was so unexpected, so nonsensical, that it didn't immediately register as something deserving of panic or fear. I simply couldn't comprehend what was happening. All I felt was a distant, dull confusion. I walked over to the next window and opened the curtains. More gray. Panning my flashlight around, I exited the room and entered the kitchen. Still, only confusion. The cheap blinds on the window there went up. More concrete. Now, the panic began to set in. I rushed over to the hallway and the entrance door to my apartment. With fumbling hands, I unlocked it and threw it wide open. The doorframe was filled from top to bottom with gray concrete. Now, finally, the panic hit me with full strength. I was walled in, somehow trapped in my own home with no way out. The thick, smothering blanket of pure terror fell over my mind. I don't know how long I was beyond reason, yelling, crying, cursing, and beating the masonry in senseless, unthinking rage. A noise broke me from my fit, half heard and distant. I fell silent, tears running down my cheeks, listening intently. Had I only imagined it?
Michael?
Ah, there it was again. A whisper, so quiet it was barely there. So low I could not make the words out. It was coming from my kitchen. I sprang to my feet and dashed through the apartment, halting in the kitchen and waiting with bated breath.
Michael? Michael, can you hear me?
The voice, muffled and faint, was coming through the wall itself. I recognized it instantly. Maria, my neighbor. I rushed over to the wall, pressing my head up close to it. Maria? Are you there?
Yes, I can hear you.
The relief in her voice was palpable. What the hell is going on, Maria?
I don't know. I woke up in the dark. All my windows are bricked up. The door as well. There's no way out.
I cursed savagely. Mine too. Is there any other way out?
No. I tried calling for help. My family, the fire brigade, the police. I can't reach anyone.
Hold on, Maria. I answered. The sound of another human being had forced down my panic, allowed me to think clearly. Thank God I was not alone. Quickly, I dialed the emergency services number. The bar on the top of the screen showed full signal, and my heart jumped when the beeping of the dial tone went silent. I'd gotten through. Hello, my name is Michael Freeman. I'm having some sort of emergency. No answer. Hello? Hello? Still nothing. I swore, hung up, and dialed another number. My brother. Again, the line was picked up. Matt, are you there? Silence. The same with my mother, my father, and several of my friends. The call would be accepted, and then there would be silence. Half an hour of failure later, I collapsed against the wall, defeated. Maria was still on the other side, but we both sat in silence for a while. Finally, I got up. Let's just think about this, I said, almost shouting to make sure Maria would hear me. I should be working tomorrow. You should be at work today. People will notice we're missing. Someone will come looking for us. We just need to hang on tight until they do.
How long, Michael?
Came the voice from beyond the wall. A few days at the very most, I promised, hoping my voice sounded more reassured than I felt. People don't just disappear like this without anyone noticing. Go check your supplies, your food, water. I'll do the same, and then we'll talk again. We got to work, and spent the next few hours making a detailed list of everything in my apartment that I would need to survive several days alone. While doing so, I also came to realize the electricity, water, and gas were still running. I flipped on all the lights in my house. Their simple, yellowed brightness had never been so welcome. Next, I filled my bathtub, sink, and every single bottle I could find with water. At the very least, thirst would not be my downfall. Food was a bit more of a problem. At a normal rate of consumption, I had enough to last me only about 3 days. I cursed at myself for putting off stocking up. I would have to ration myself. By the time Maria and I got back in contact, it was almost 5 p.m. "How's it looking on your side?" I asked.
I have enough water,
She answered.
and the food should last me for about a week and a half if I'm careful. The power hasn't been cut either.
Good. We just need to stay calm, not do anything stupid. And someone will come find us, I promise. We sat in silence, but my mind was racing. Who could have done this? Why would someone do this, and how? And why was no one answering our calls for help? None of it made sense, and my mind spun at the sheer number of unanswered questions. Was everyone else in the building trapped? My flat only connected to Maria's, being built on the corner of the block. Were all the other residents imprisoned as well? I didn't voice any of my concerns. Maria was a gentle, kind person, and I did not want to burden her with more trouble. If she broke down on me, or got injured, there would be no way for me to help her. Worse still, being separated from my only human contact might be enough for the panic to return. Eventually, I passed out, the exhaustion of the situation overpowering my body's attempt to stay lucid. My dreams were filled with darkness and cold, hard stone pressing in on me from all sides. I awoke to the sound of Maria beating on the wall next to me. Heart hammering, I leapt to my feet. "Maria! Maria! What's happening?"
The bricks, Michael. The door. It's gotten worse.
I ran through my apartment, heading for the entrance hallway. I froze in horror as I realized what exactly Maria had meant. Half the hallway, several meters of space, were now gone. Simply gone. In their place was only cold, hard stone. It was as if the gray mass had simply flowed over and swallowed half the room. What the hell?" I yelled. "What the hell is going on?" I dashed through the house, gaze frantically switching left and right, half expecting to see the walls close on me even as I watched, or for the concrete to come pouring in through the windows like some sort of demented landslide. Maria's voice came through the wall.
Michael.
She said, her voice somehow calm, soothing.
Michael, you have to calm down. Breathe. Just breathe.
I sat down on my heels, forcing my racing breath to slow. Gradually, my heart stopped beating so frantically, and a semblance of calm came over me. Did you hear anything in the night?" I asked, forcing myself to think, to analyze. "Someone getting into the house so they could do this?"
No.
Answered Maria.
There was no one here, Michael. No one went in. How could they even enter? They'd have to knock the walls down.
Then, how could this happen? I asked, my head spinning. What is going on?
I don't know any more than you do,
Came the answer. Somehow, Maria was remaining calm, even as the walls of our apartment slowly grew closer and closer. I had never expected this inner strength from her. She was a small, fragile-looking woman, but disguised underneath was a bravery and resolve that put me to shame.
People will have noticed we're missing by now.
She said, her voice soothing.
By this time tomorrow, we'll be out of here.
We spent the day sitting with our backs against the connecting wall, talking about anything that came to our mind. The conversations were banal at best and often nonsensical. We didn't mind. Anything was better than confronting the reality of our situation. As the day dragged on and evening came, my hopes dropped. No one had come to rescue us, despite Maria's words. I forced myself to eat a ration of food, despite my anxiety-clenched throat. As the night wore on, Maria went silent. I knew she had simply fallen asleep, but still. I had to force myself not to beat on the wall and call her name to make sure she was all right. Eventually, I too fell into an uneasy slumber, propped up against the wall. The dreams were even worse than the first night, and I woke breathing heavily, certain I was being crushed alive by walls that moved. I didn't even have time to fully wake up before a fresh wave of dread hit me. A glance through sleep-encrusted eyes had been enough to set the nightmare in motion once again. Shit! Across the room from me, I could see the door that led to the hallway. Except the hallway was no longer there. Where it had been, there was now only smooth, cold concrete. Through the wall, I heard Maria gasp, then curse.
Maria! Maria, are you alright?
I yelled.
Did it get worse?
Yes. The whole hallway is blocked off.
She answered.
Michael, my flat is smaller than yours. The room I have now is the only one left.
For the first time, a hint of despair had entered her voice. My heart sank. Another panic attack loomed over me, but it was beaten down, crushed by a sudden explosion of fury. We were trapped, imprisoned in our own homes. We were being crushed, day by day, night by night, like the victims of some sort of slow torture device. Someone, somehow, had done this to us, left us alone and cowering. No more. No more. I would not let it end like this. I leapt to my feet with a cry of anger.
Michael, what's happening?
Asked Maria, concern in her voice.
I'm getting you out. Do you hear me?
I yelled.
I'm getting you out, and then together, we're gonna end this nightmare.
I rushed through the flat and into my room. I had a small pile of tools there. Hammers, saws, cables. Running over to it, I pulled out a small sledgehammer. Nothing heavy duty. It could not get me through the heavy, thick concrete which now sealed me off from the outside world. The wall separating me and Maria, though, it couldn't be very thick, and it was built from cheap, fragile plaster. I would break through it, save Maria, and then we would find a way out of here. Ignoring Maria's calls of confusion, I rushed back into the kitchen, hefted the sledgehammer, and swung it with all my rage-fueled power. The plaster wall cracked. I pulled back and struck again and again. It was heavy going, but my anger gave me strength. Soon I had cleared a man-sized opening. Beyond was still more plaster and wood. I kept swinging. I paused to get my breath. I could hear Maria through the wall, so close now. One more swing, and I would pierce the last layer between us. The anticipation was unbearable. I could finally see another human in my imprisonment. Somehow, such a simple thing felt monumental. I hacked again, but the blow must have not bitten deep, only tearing away the top layer of the remaining plaster. I swung again and again, certain that in any second I would be through. How many swings of the hammer did I tell myself would be the last? 12? 2 dozen? More? How long was I digging? certain I was on the very edge of success. I don't know. Eventually, the horrible truth dawned on me. I turned in my self-wrought tunnel, and my heart fell. I was standing in a long tunnel, far longer than the 2 walls separating our flats could possibly be. All the time I'd been digging, I could have sworn Maria was just centimeters away. Just one swing of the hammer separating us. It was all a lie. I collapsed to the floor, coughing in the swirling dust of my failed demolition. Maria was silent for a while. When she spoke, it was in a low, defeated voice.
You can't get through, can you?
She asked, although it was more of an observation than a question.
I can hear you. It's like you're centimeters away. So close, and yet you can never get through.
There was nothing more to say. No words of support or hope either of us could tell the other. Our hopes had been crushed, destroyed utterly. We sat in silence for several hours. Once I walked back through the tunnel to move my stores of water and food into the room farthest from the advancing concrete. I realized then that it didn't matter whether I was in the passageway or not. I could hear Maria just as well from the kitchen. All my digging had achieved nothing at all, brought me not one step closer to her. That night, the dreams were an almost welcome diversion from the reality I would wake to. When I eventually came to, I found the door of my last room filled with featureless gray stone. I was now effectively restricted to it, with no way to reach the rest of the house. I cried out to Maria, but there was no answer. My blood ran cold, the panic threatening to overwhelm me. Running over to the wall, I beat on it, shouting and cursing. At first, there was no answer, and I fell to the ground, sobbing. Then, I heard something. A tapping on the wall, coming from the height of my head as I lay, kneeling in my despair. I listened intently. The sound was coming at intervals, sometimes long, sometimes short. It carried on, repeating, unchanging for hours. I tried calling out, certain this had to be Maria. There was no answer. No voice calling back. Only the tapping. After several hours, the sound became more frantic. The tempo increased, the rhythm and repeating intervals collapsing. It changed into a frantic staccato, a desperate drum roll. I yelled and beat the wall in return, but was helpless to intervene. Soon, it became fainter, the impacts growing weaker. Eventually, it stopped altogether. Silence fell. I cried for the death of the only companion I had in my imprisonment. That was yesterday. I think my own end is not far away either. When I awoke today, it was to pitch blackness, despite having kept all the lights on when I passed out from fatigue. I tried to rise, but found I could not. All around me, there is only stone. I lie on cold brickwork. I cannot lift my head more than a few centimeters. It was only through slow, painful contortion that I could bring my phone from my pocket and into my face, so I could squint at its screen. No one will answer me, but perhaps if my initial calls for help could get out, so can this message. Please, help me. My battery is almost empty, and when it dies, there's nothing more I can do. I cannot move. I cannot see. I can only beat the walls of my prison in terror. My name is Michael. Please help me. There's no more horrific sound than the screams of a mother who has just lost her child. Those were the sounds that awoke me in the middle of the night, when the neighbor's boy passed away during the night. Officially, he died from an undiagnosed hereditary heart condition, but the rumors told another story entirely. Mary had always been a big part of our community, arranging barbecues and birthday parties, getting along with each and everyone in the neighborhood, all while being a working single mother. Her son, Ulrich, was the most lively boy, outgoing and smart. We all expected big things from him as he grew up, and he loved the attention. Needless to say, his passing hurt us all, but none were as devastated as her. She pulled away from the community, hid inside her home. I don't even think she ever returned to work, until she just disappeared. I only got the chance to speak to her one time before she went missing, at which point she decided to tell me just what had happened the night that her son died. It was one of those rare occasions where she'd let Ulrich stay up past his bedtime to watch a movie. She was busy in her office doing paperwork, letting her son have a moment of peace, feeling all grown up. He was watching one of the old Terminator movies, a bit out of his age range, but she let him have it and pretended not to know. That was until just before midnight. She had drifted off, still in her chair, as she heard a scream coming from the living room.
Mom!
Ulrich was calling for her, and she didn't hesitate to come to his rescue.
Mom!
He called again.
What is it? What happened?
Mary called out in shock. On the way to rush there, she'd grabbed the only thing she could find to fashion as a weapon, which turned out to be her son's tiny baseball bat. "There's a man on the TV," he said meekly. The movie had ended, but rather than replacing it with advertisements or a second movie, there was only static filling the screen.
A man?
She asked. "Yes, he wanted to hurt me," Ulrich cried. Mary stared at the television, showing nothing but snow plastered across the screen. Then she let her guard down, finally realizing that his scream had been caused by a nightmare. She knew then that letting him watch a movie restricted well above his age had been a mistake.
It was just a dream, Ulrich.
She said comfortingly as she hugged him tightly. "No, he was there, on the TV," Ulrich cried. "He was bad."
It's all right.
Mary simply responded, still holding on to him.
I'll keep you safe. Just go to bed and know that I'm always watching over you.
Her voice was the most calming thing that anyone had ever heard. It didn't matter what words she uttered, because once they'd been heard, people just calmed down. She was that pure, that wonderful. It calmed Ulrich right down, and after another tight hug, he headed to bed. But as Mary went to turn off the static-covered TV, she could have sworn she saw the outline of a man, staring back, whispering something indecipherable. She shook her head, trying to wake herself up, and the world fell back into silence. It was late, and sleep deprivation had already taken over her exhausted mind. She didn't even make it out of the living room. She just passed out on the sofa as soon as she shut the TV off. It wouldn't be until the middle of the night before she awoke from a sore neck. As she made her way to her room, she noticed Ulrich's door creaked open. While he was still young, he was a tiny man who liked his privacy, so she thought she'd check in on him, making sure he wasn't suffering through any nightmares. At first, he seemed to be sleeping, but his position was odd, kind of drooping over the bed with his back fixed in an unnatural position. She turned the lights off, knowing he'd easily sleep through the dim illumination. And then she just froze in place as she realized that Ulrich's eyes were open. They looked kind of glassy, unmoving and lifeless. With careful steps, she approached him, and for each foot closer, it became more apparent that his back had been completely broken. As the realization hit her, she rushed over and kneeled beside him, not sure whether to touch him or to leave him be. His back was shattered, as were his arms and legs. There wasn't a single unharmed bone left in the little boy's body. He was dead, and had been for some time. Still, Mary tried to resuscitate him as she awaited the ambulance. The paramedics practically had to pull her away before they could remove the mangled body. In the following days, she'd be visited by various detectives who were investigating the place. She told them all she knew, including the strange man hidden in the static. But there was nothing anyone could do. It was a ridiculous story, and only Mary herself knew it to be true. I'm not sure why she told me her story. Not if she ever shared it with anyone else. How she felt, how his body looked where it lay in bed. But those were the last words she ever spoke to me before she just vanished from the face of the earth. No body was ever found, but traces of blood were scattered all over her home. Even in the absence of her corpse, no one could have survived that amount of blood loss. So the rumor spread. I told my wife, who told her friends, and before long, everyone knew about the man on the TV, hidden in static. It started a sort of urban legend, telling everyone to turn their TVs off before 12 and to never under any circumstances fall asleep on the couch with a movie running in the background. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the tragedy of Ulrich's death and Mary's disappearance turned from one filled with sorrow to a mystery overflowing with intrigue. People would start to actively seek out the static-filled channel, but none would ever discover it. None until my wife accidentally fell asleep while watching a movie. It was just after 12, and I'd returned from a late shift. As I stepped inside, I could see the living room illuminated by a pale, white light that danced in the dark. Atop of that, a quiet, staticky sound was penetrating the silence of night. "Elise, are you up?" I asked loudly, to no response. "Elise, come on!" I called out again as I was starting to figure out what had happened. I stormed into the living room to find a static-filled TV screen illuminating the room. I paused as I noticed a man hidden behind the static, just barely visible through the snow. But no sooner had I entered the room than he vanished from sight. Then I turned to the couch to find my wife sleeping peacefully. The commotion had just about woken her up.
What's going on?
She asked with a groggy voice. But I couldn't respond. The split-second long sight of the man had awoken an innate fear deep within me. In that moment, I knew that everything Mary had told me was true, and it terrified me. "What have you done?" I asked in panic.
I was just watching a movie. I fell asleep. I didn't mean to.
She said, getting more afraid herself as she noticed just how scared I was. "Let's go to our room. Come on," I demanded. I wasn't a brave man, nor a strong one, but I had a gun I inherited from my dad after he passed away. While it was kind of old, he'd regularly used it for practice. I'd never been a fan of weapons myself, but desperate times and all that. We retreated back into our room and shut the doors. Elise sat down on the bed while I prepared the gun.
What are you doing?
She asked. "Don't worry, I'm not going to shoot anyone. It's just a precaution," I said.
What's gonna happen to us?
She asked. "Nothing, we'll be fine," I lied. Truth be told, I'd never gone into detail about Ulrich's death. I'd mentioned the TV, and I'd told her that he'd passed away unnaturally. But I didn't mention the broken bones and destroyed body.
Then why do you...
She stopped in her tracks.
What was that?
What was... My question was interrupted by loud whispers coming from outside. It was a deep voice calling out, distorted as if talking through a radio.
Is that coming from the TV?
Elise asked. I don't know, but I'm gonna check it out, I said.
No, stay here. Call the police.
Fine, you call them. I'll make sure there aren't any intruders in the house.
Gary, wait!
She shouted in a loud whisper, but it was too late. I had already opened the door and gone outside, making sure to shut it securely behind me. It might have been a stupid idea, but the protective instinct within me had taken over. If someone or something had entered my house, I'd make damn sure that it didn't hurt the one person I loved the most. So I snuck back into the living room, holding my gun ready. I half expected to find the TV turned back on as the source of the sound, which left me surprised when I entered the living room to find it pitch black. Everything was turned off. And then the voices returned, coming from the basement. Now, I knew we had an ancient television from my dad's youth stacked down there, but it wasn't connected and hadn't been functioning in decades. It was an antique kept as a memory more than anything else. Still, if I had to destroy it to make sure the voice went away, then so be it. I stepped inside as the voice grew louder, still indecipherable behind the mess of static. Step by step, I descended the dark staircase into the abyss that was my basement. It didn't have a functioning source of light. The electricity had been turned off following a flood in the summer, and was still awaiting repairs. So I used the dim flashlight attached to my mobile to guide my way, still holding my weapon high.
If anyone's down there, you better show yourself right now.
I yelled, hoping the police would show up before I encountered anyone. But no one would respond, so I kept descending, noticing a dim, flickering white light at the bottom. I instantly recognized it as static from a TV, which meant the unconnected ancient piece of technology had somehow turned itself on. I jumped the last 2 steps and pointed my gun in the direction of the light with haste, only to find a staticky picture emitting from the disconnected, broken TV. In the center, I noticed a man staring through the noise. He was clearer than before, with a scar-covered face and limbs that reached too far, their ends even surpassing the edge of the screen. It whispered something else, unintelligible like the rest, but there was a single word I could make out.
Sacrifice.
Then I heard the sirens, pulling my attention away just for a moment. But that was all it took. The room had fallen back into darkness, and the police had arrived. I rushed back upstairs to find not 1 or 2, but a dozen patrol cars rushing into our streets. The officers emerged and all rushed to various houses. Only a couple came over to me.
Mr. Larson?
One of them asked. I nodded.
We received a call from your wife. We believe she may be in danger.
Yeah, but she locked herself inside the room. She should be fine, I explained.
Mind if we have a look?
We walked together to our bedroom, which was locked from the inside. The officers knocked at first, trying to get her attention. No response. "Honey, Elise, please open up," I called out. By then, the officers had realized something was wrong. They gave each other a nod before preparing to break open the door. It shattered with a bang, and the officers stormed inside. They halted quickly as they found my wife. She was lying on the bed with her mouth wide open. Her jaw had seemingly been dislocated, and her neck was fractured in multiple places. She had the same empty gaze Mary had described, dead and beyond saving. The officers didn't even attempt to resuscitate her. It was too late. But as broken as I felt, the night wouldn't end there. Because from the chatter I could hear, Each of the 24 officers reported finding dead bodies all over the neighborhood. Each of them broken beyond belief, with their significant others, children, or parents reporting television showing static and hearing whispers. That night, 15 people died in their homes, all having views of a static-filled image hiding a man. But there was never more than one victim. I realized the mistake I'd made by searching for the intruder. It is nothing but a distraction causing me to leave my wife alone, a trap to kill her. I've considered ending my life, but I need answers. I need to know why my wife died, and who it was. The only clue I have is Mary. Despite her blood being discovered all around the apartment, her body was never found, which is something that deviates away from the other murders. She might still be alive, and she might have the answers I so desperately seek. Okay, I'll admit it. I'm an idiot. I fell asleep on the bus like a dingus, and now I don't know where I am. Like, I really don't know where I am. I reach into my pocket and try my phone. 17% left. I should be okay. I load up Google Maps, or at least I try to, and I tap my finger against the screen impatiently as the bus rumbles softly through an unfamiliar part of the city. Could even be a different city? How long were you asleep, Yaz? I studied the time displayed at the top of the phone for the first time. Oh God, I've been sleeping for over an hour. What the hell is wrong with me? I decide to give up on maps and just go straight to my contacts. The phone dips to 16% as I'm scrolling to my mom's number. I tap it and raise the device to my ear. The phone beeps, then crackles, and then just goes silent. I can't even tell if she's picked up. I try for a second time, but the calls don't seem to be going through. My breathing gets a little shallower. I'm starting to freak out a bit now. I allow myself a tentative glance around the bus. I've never been a confident girl. The idea of admitting to someone that I've been an idiot and gotten myself lost, it makes my skin crawl. Yes, even to these strangers. If you're an introvert like me, then you'll be able to empathize. I'm well aware of how pathetic it is, but I hate talking to strangers. Worse if I have to admit some fault as I'm doing so. There are 3 others on the bus, not including the driver. A young woman a few years older than myself, maybe in her early 20s, near the back. And a few rows ahead are a man and his daughter sitting in strained silence. I don't want to talk to them. They're giving off a really weird vibe, and the thought of waking somebody up, that's mortifying. So I remain in place, shifting uncomfortably. I stare out the window at the scenes beyond, willing, hoping, praying that I'm going to see a familiar statue or a landmark. I'll recognize a street sign or something, and I'll be able to make my way home. But there is nothing. Only the grimy walls of rundown buildings, tents constructed across the sidewalks beneath flickering streetlights. The longer I wait, potentially, the worse it gets. But I can't bring myself to move. I just stare at the scenes beyond as the sun starts to set in the distance. The world outside is cast in a faint, dusty red, and I realize I'm running out of options. Yes, get a grip. People make mistakes. You have to speak to the driver. Just go and ask them where we are and if we're going back the way we came. Go on. I spend the next 5 minutes rehearsing what I'm going to say in my head. And then, with a deep breath, I rise to a stand. Body now in motion, I step into the aisle and stride down the length of the bus, the front drawing closer and closer as my heart pounds. I stop by the driver and quietly clear my throat. "Excuse me," I begin. "Sorry to bother you." The driver interrupts with a grunt and taps the little sign by the wheel. "Do not talk to driver," it reads. I squirm, but press on. I have to. "I'm sorry, but I don't know where I am. I've missed my stop. Are we going back or..." Another grunt, louder this time, and the driver knocks the sign with his knuckles more violently. I freeze. I hadn't prepared for a reaction like this. After another long moment more, and all without even taking his eyes from the road, the driver grabs a glossy papered, printed bus route from a rack to his left and slaps it down on the counter. I stutter out a quick thanks and grab it up, returning humiliated to my seat. I pass by the girl and her dad as I do so. Something compels me to glance up from the floor, and I do so. I meet the girl's eyes. She's about the same age as me, and she looks frightened. The man looks straight ahead. He doesn't look like he could be her dad, to tell the truth. And his hand is on her leg. My concerns with the driver are suddenly lost beneath a much thicker layer of panic. I try to rationalize the situation as I pass them by and sit down back into my seat. But I can't. I think the girl is in danger, and as the only one who knows, it's now on me to do something about it. My heart rate seems to double in my chest. I put my head in my hands, and I run them through my hair. I try to ignore what I saw and study the glossy bus route. It's useless. I don't recognize the map, nor any of the stops. The place I got on isn't even listed. I stuff it away and look out the window. My leg jitters, and I peer back down the aisle at the man and the girl. Is he sitting closer than he was before, or am I imagining it? Oh God, what do I do? And what if I'm wrong? What if I've misjudged the situation entirely and I cause a huge scene? I think I would just about die from the humiliation. But the clock is ticking. I imagine myself watching the news tomorrow. I see a headline about a girl who befell some terrible, twisted fate. I clench my hands against my knees. Something is going to happen, I can feel it. Something bad is going to happen if I let it. I try to put myself in her place. If I was being harassed, if I felt threatened or in danger, what would I want someone to do? What would I want them to do? Something is the answer that comes to me. I would want them to do something. So before I can psych myself out, I rise once again to a stand. I expect to feel the blood drain from my body, but instead, I'm caught in a wave of adrenaline. I stride into the aisle, a little closer, and I call out loud, way louder than I had planned. "Excuse me." The man remains facing ahead, but the girl swivels in her seat to look at me. "Are you okay?" I ask her, and she shakes her head. "Driver," I shout to the front. "There's a girl in trouble on your bus. She's in danger." The man beside her jumps right out of his seat at once and spins to face me. I get a much better look at him. I was right, though. He doesn't look anything like the girl. Not that there's much that's even physically weird about the guy. He looks terrifyingly normal. Normal except for his eyes. Like a shark's, they stare blankly right through me at nothing. The tension in the bus pulls tighter. I am holding my breath. The man seems to realize he has made an unfortunate mistake by drawing attention to himself, and for one terrible moment, I think he's going to come after me. I double down my efforts and raise a shaking hand, a hand that ends in a pointing and accusatory finger. Keep your distance, and stay away from her," I warn him, in a voice that threatens to leave me altogether. Something bizarre happens next. Something really, really weird. But the stress of the situation won't allow me to process the events for a little while yet. The driver, without speaking and without stopping the bus, rises swiftly from his seat. Emotionlessly, he strolls down the aisle and unceremoniously grabs the man from behind around his arms. The predator barks with frustration and struggles, but the driver, despite being physically smaller, doesn't even break a sweat. He drags the flailing man back through the bus, pulls the lever to open the bus's door, and, to my shock, throws him out. He throws the man right out onto the street. Then he sits back in his chair, closes the door with a soft hiss, and resumes control of the wheel, as if nothing had even happened. I stand there for perhaps a minute more, though I have no idea of the times, really, until I stumble back into my seat in a daze. The second I do so, the girl springs from her seat and rushes down the aisle into the free one next to me, with a huge smile of relief on her face. She squeezes me tight in a hug. "Oh my God," she mutters. "Thank you so much." I hug her back, my pulse slowly starting to steady. It's okay. I'm actually freaking out a little, to be honest. Wow, I've never done anything like that in my whole life. Wow. Well, I'm glad you did, she says, pulling back and smiling at me. He came out of nowhere. I fell asleep for a while, which I know is dumb, but when I woke up, he was sitting right next to me. There were so many empty seats, I didn't know what to do. I froze up, I guess. "You fell asleep too?" I ask her, frowning. I glance to the back of the bus. Despite all the clamor, the sleeping young woman I clocked earlier still hasn't moved. Still fast asleep. She slept right through it. There's something really weird going on here. I was sleeping too, which I never normally do in public. I woke up and I didn't recognize anything through the windows. I'm totally lost, to be honest. "Me too," she says, staring right at me. "What the hell is going on? And did you see what the driver did? The driver grabbed the guy and just threw him off a moving bus? That's not something that happens." "I know." I pause. "I know." We exchange another look, and some of the tension eases. "I'm Yaz, by the way. It's nice to meet you." "Leah," she replies with a grin and a nervous little laugh. We're both kind of on edge here, to be honest. And can you blame us? If only my brother was here, Ryan. He's a year younger than me, but he's so smart. Street smart, at least. He would know what to do. Ugh, I hope he's okay. The last thing I said to him was really rude. An irrational fear that I may never see him again passes through me, and I shiver, doing my best to dispel it. He'd be handling this whole situation a hell of a lot better than me. I've never really known how to talk to people. I'm already deeply self-conscious about my interactions with Leah. I hope I'm not coming across too weirdly. I don't have many friends. But regardless, I'm allowing myself to get sidetracked. I need a plan. I need to think like Ryan would. The bus has to stop eventually, right? I asked the girl. It'll be a depot or a station, something. We'll either get on another bus or there'll be a taxi we can take. I don't have loads of money, but we could definitely cover some distance in the right direction. Leah asks where I live, and I tell her. With a smile of pleasant surprise, she tells me she actually lives like 2 blocks over. We bond further, but our conversation is cut short as the bus plunges into a sudden tunnel in the side of a hill. The tunnel is normal at first. Little yellow lights in the ceiling speed by, casting dim, scanning beams of gold through the windows and over the seats in regular waves. But the lights fade. Leah and I grow silent as we stare out the windows. The lights disappear, one by one, until we are driving through pitch dark. Black. The bus speeds along, showing no signs of slowing. But there's nothing to be seen through any of the windows. The vehicle rumbles and my pulse races, and we speed on through the dark. What the hell is happening? Where are we? Leah whispers to me, but of course I have no idea. I have no idea at all, and I don't think I'd be able to speak right now even if I had something to say. All my efforts are currently focused on fighting a rapidly growing, pounding sense of dread. One that beats like a drum as it threatens my constitution. I have lost all sense of how fast we might be going. The only confirmation that we are moving at all is the ever-rumbling and bumping of the bus engine against my feet and back. Wait, I murmur to Leah. Look ahead, there's a light. And sure enough, a tiny pinprick of light far ahead flickers into sight. And then it rushes towards us, growing and growing. In fact, it's growing faster than the bus is actually traveling. I'm sure of it. The effect is of something massive and glowing hurtling right towards us. And compared to the pitch darkness of the tunnel, it is bright as hell. I cry out in alarm and screw my eyes tight shut, in part due to the light sensitivity and in part due to reflex. And even through my closed eyelids, I can tell that the bus has exited the tunnel, as my surroundings are washed in a dusky orange light. The bus rumbles, and Leah grabs my sleeve. "Yaz," she says urgently. "Yaz, look." Tentatively I do so. I open my eyes and gasp in horror. If I thought my previous surroundings were unfamiliar, then they were nothing on this. Dark, desolate, and deep-scorched plains of gritty gray stone extend far out to the horizon in every direction. The plains are littered with crumbled clusters of concrete and the iron-beam skeletons of curious buildings, long since swept away in the winds as dust. I shoot a look behind the bus's back window, and am greeted by the sight of the rapidly receding tunnel, extending out from the base of a jagged black mountain. "Oh my God," I mutter. "This is..." I don't have the words. I don't know what to say. The sky is a cloudless sunset orange, and unless my mind is playing tricks on me, the shadows across the plains don't quite seem to line up with the angle of the sun. A low red ball that hangs deliriously above the far black mountains. And in the distance, in the very far distance, is something moving. Something colossal and alien. I cannot make out the intricacies, but it shambles slowly through the wastes on 4 seemingly mechanical legs. One heavy footstep at a time. What the hell am I gonna do? He calls me his masterpiece. From Man, the Machine. That's what the plaque says. I can't see it, but he's told me that's my title. All I can see is the screen and the onlookers on the other side of the glass. Looking at both is still disorienting. I'm not used to my eyes being so far apart, and don't reckon I ever will be. Also, I miss blinking. A lot. His name is Tobias Kienziel. There are 2 things you need to know about him. 1, he's an artist. 2, he's completely insane. You'd recognize him if you saw him straight away. That mirror-surfaced glass eye is hard to miss. Chances are you won't see him though. Not unless you're down on your luck. If you have already heard of him and are alive to read this, then screw you. Why? Because it means you're one of the oily leeches on the other side of the glass. One of the ones gawping at me. The ones rich and wealthy enough to know about Tobias Kienziel and his gallery of anatomical defiance. I've recognized dozens of them. So many of the faces I saw in the papers and on TV have seen me too. I doubt they think of me as a me anymore though. If they ever did see us dregs, drifters, and junkies as people, that is. Hell, Tobias's gallery is probably the only time folk like that acknowledge that folk like me exist at all. That's how I met him, you see. I needed money for a fix. The ad in the paper was simple enough. Artists looking for models with unusual histories. Cash in hand, address below. Did I question the danger of that vagueness? No. My junk-focused mind only noticed those 3 little words, cash in hand. It took me nearly an hour walking deep into the sprawling industrial district to find the place. By this point in my attic journey, I was used to walking until my feet bled to get a fix. I was already imagining the prick of the needle and rush of euphoria when my shaking finger pressed on the buzzer of the large, derelict warehouse. Normal people that don't wake up in gutters, would have been suspicious of the near-abandoned industrial estate. Folk like yourselves would probably have turned around and looked for safer ways to make some scratch. I wasn't folk like yourselves, though. At the time, this ominous cube of brick and mortar with its boarded windows and distance from the safety of civilization was no different from any building I woke up in. The voice that answered the intercom also would have made you flee, I bet. Not me, though. I'd spent too many decades destroying my mind to pick up the obvious sinister honey trap tones in that high-pitched crooning.
Yes?
It was Tobias that answered. Not that I knew it then. At the time, all I registered was that it was a German voice. Male, but cracking and splitting in pitch at odd points.
Can I help you?
Advert model I managed. My throat hurt, and I realized it had been almost 2 days since I'd spoken to anyone with more than a grunt. If I had legs, I'd kick myself for taking my vocal cords for granted. Tobias either didn't notice or didn't care about my near-broken speech patterns. His response was ecstatic.
Ah, wonderful. I'll buzz you in. Please head straight up the stairs.
There was only one other door leading from the stairwell on the other side, and this was at the top of 5 flights of stairs. I was wheezing by the time I reached the top, out of breath. I could walk for miles on the promise of a fix, but stairs were a different story. I almost fell through the door at the top. I had to bend over for a few moments, wheezing and breathing in deep gulps of dusty air to catch my breath. That's what made it so easy for him to crack the baseball bat over the back of my head. I was more than used to coming around in strange places without remembering how I'd gotten there. I was also used to the numbness in my extremities. One of the first things I registered on waking, aside from the throbbing pain behind my eyes. It wasn't until my wits swam into focus enough to register the mirror-eyed man standing a few feet in front of me that I started to worry. "Ah," he crooned. "Good. You're finally awake. I was worried that I'd overdone it. That would have been very disappointing." I started to gather more of my cognition. I realized I'd gone a while without a fix, because my heart was pounding somewhere that felt too far away. My eyes stung, and I knew that if I could feel my arms and legs, they'd be sweat-covered and jittery. How long... what? My voice coming through weak, feeble, and distant. Tobias tutted, waggling a finger. "Now please, don't try speaking just yet. You need to be calm. Calm and collected. Everything will make sense once I've given you the tour." He clapped his hands, rubbing them together and beaming. "Tour? What?" "Shh! You must save your strength. We have not one moment to waste." He strode out of view, and with a growing alarm, I realized that I couldn't turn my head to follow. I couldn't even move my eyes. I stared straight ahead, unable to do anything else. Eyes itching as the room that had been around the mauve-suited, one-eyed man swam into focus. It wasn't the room at the top of the stairs. That had been dark, dusty, lit only by what daylight managed to fight through a row of windows along the top of one wall. The room I was in when I came to had no windows, and was better lit, but not much. The slight increase in light came from 2 naked bulbs hanging on frayed wires, flickering things that cast a pathetic yellow gleam across the tiled walls and floor. There was also less dust in the air, but the smell of anesthetic and coal fumes that replaced it was far from welcome. I'm assuming it was still in the warehouse, that I'm still in the warehouse, but I have no way to prove this. It looked less abandoned, less forgotten than the warehouse. Although, again, not much. But this offered no comfort. It's hard to find any comfort in anything when you wake up in a filthy, blood-splattered surgical theater, especially one with a forge, anvil, welder, and smelting equipment clearly visible in one corner. Especially when in the opposite corner, there's a large canvas and steel frame laundry bin, filled with bulges that leak a dark red through the fabric. Especially when you recognize one of the feet poking out the top of said gore-filled bag. The hammering of my ventricles intensified, made worse by the fact that my panicking body could not find lungs with which to take frantic, shallow breaths. I couldn't feel my chest at all. To my increasing terror, I still couldn't feel much of anything, and what I could feel felt wrong, twisted, out of place. My feet were still absent, but my tingling fingers weren't where I remembered them ever being. My twisting gut rumbled from somewhere behind my face, which itself was totally numb save for the acute pricking of my dry eyes. I still couldn't blink either, look anywhere but directly ahead. When I screamed, the sound echoed from elsewhere, away from the spot my frightened mind was used to hearing that howl from. And the ears I heard with? Tinny, ringing, and again, totally absent from my perception of physical sensation. I would have tried to struggle, but I couldn't find any muscles to struggle with. All I could do was scream. "Stop that!" The mirror-eyed Tobias was in my field of view once more. This time, his expression was furious. His Germanic crooning laced with razor wire. "Stop that caterwauling immediately! I don't want to have to silence you. It will ruin the effect." I stopped screaming, but not entirely because of his threat. It was because of the reflection that I caught in his mirrored, chrome-left eye. What I saw rendered me too confused, too horrified to do anything, even scream. I suspect that if Tobias hadn't taken chemical measures to prevent it, I would have lost consciousness once more. It was only a glimpse, and a distorted, confused one at that, but it was enough for me to instantly understand the severity and futility of my situation. I should have seen my face looking back at me in the reflection of that eye. I didn't. Where's my... I heard my voice drifting from way off, despite feeling nothing from any mouth, jaw, teeth, or throat. "All in good time, my little prize." Tobias sounded jovial as he fiddled and clanked with something behind me. My vision juddered, and then, without warning, I swiveled 180 degrees. At the time, I figured Tobias had strapped me into some kind of wheelchair. Again, there was panic-inducing cognitive dissonance. This time, at the absence of inertia, or jolting sensation as he pushed me through the thick double doors. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I only knew it was a hallway because of the brief glimpse I got of the long red carpet trailing off into the shadows before the doors slammed behind us. My eyes registered nothing in this new place. My ears were a different story. From wherever they were, they picked up tinny whimpers, muffled metallic sobs, and faint, organic grinding coming from deep in the darkness. My gut, one of only 2 organs I could still feel, twisted itself into an even tighter knot. My heart threatened to bruise itself from how hard it was hammering against my ribs. Or I naively thought at the time. Both of these sensations intensified from the feeling of the wind against my naked eyes. The realization that Tobias was wheeling me toward those haunting groans, moans, and wet crunches. I didn't realize we'd stopped moving until my ears picked up the click of a light switch, and my eyes were flooded with white light from a strip bulb hung in a small alcove along one wall. Tobias had placed me in front of this alcove directly facing it, so that my immobile eyes could take in the collection of framed paintings it contained.
These, my little prize, are the Bramfield paintings. They were my muse, my catalyst, my spark. What started me on my journey toward here, toward now, toward you.
If I weren't already terrified of the consequences of crossing that sickly crooning from behind me, I would have screamed again. Compared to what I was about to witness, these paintings were, well, tame. Had they been the last stop on Tobias's gallery tour, I'd have been numb to them. As numb to them as was most of my worryingly still unresponsive body. I didn't fully realize what was happening yet, though. And without the wider context, those paintings alone were already enough to send the 2 organs I could still feel into convulsions. They were, without a doubt, painted by somebody who had seen hell. Nobody could paint things that detailed, that monstrously, hideously intricate, unless they'd seen them firsthand.
Beautiful, aren't they?
The venomous crooning said, sighing.
When I first saw them as a child, I knew that Bramfield, he had something different. Something none of these other pretenders with their outsider art could ever capture. Something raw, something real. I was naively grateful that Tobias didn't have me linger in front of the paintings for long. He was far too eager to show me his own work to let me study the paintings of his self-appointed teacher, his horrific muse, for more than a few minutes. It was still too long, though. Obscenity took on new meaning for me when I saw those paintings. Despite never being religious, the only word I have for those oil colors is blasphemy. Blasphemy not against any god, but against life itself. There was a vast landscape of a gigantic baby's head. It had no body, unless you can call a fleshy, glistening maggot's tail a body. But it did have limbs. 8 of them, in fact. Brittle, raking arms that sprouted from asymmetrical, pustule-coated lumps behind either ear. Its eyes were cold beyond reason. A deadness in them returned my gaze in a way no brush should have been able to capture. Another was a smaller portrait of a man with mouths for eyes. Something about his moist, glistening skin, his pallid, phlegm-coated lips, his hideous, wide grin triggered a deep fear in me. Far worse than his mismatched facial anatomy, though. This one disturbs me in retrospect, mostly because of how much it directly inspired the first of Tobias's own pieces. On my first, and thankfully only, viewing, it disturbed me mostly because of the laughter I had to convince myself I couldn't hear when I focused on it. Finally, there was that damn throne. It's the one thing in all of Bramfield's work that disturbs me as much as the art of Tobias's it inspired. Well, almost. It was the smallest of all the framed canvases, yet it held my attention the longest. It was a throne of corpses, thousands of them, all photorealistic. The twisted screams of pain and agony on each face, reminiscent of any captured image of a mass grave after a human atrocity. Every single one told a story of agony, of suffering beyond all comprehension or reason. At the top of the corpse pyre, sitting at the peak of the pile of naked bodies almost too high above for the artist to render, was a figure in a cloud of dark mist.
I've never been more thankful of anything than I am for the fact the painter, this Bramfield, wasn't close enough to make out any details of their form. I am writing to you at a time when I've seen more nightmares than any person should have, in an even marginally fair world. Despite everything I have seen, the memory of that figure on its throne of wailing death still terrifies me. As I said, though, Tobias didn't give me much time to wallow in Bramfield's oil and canvas terror. He had terrors of his own to share, and his enthusiasm to do so was palpable.
Brilliant, aren't they? Unrivaled, some say. Me, though? No. Rivaled in my book. Very much rivaled. Beaten. By me, of course. As you'll soon see, my little prize.
There was another click, and we were once more in inky, sightless dark. Once more, a stinging breeze whistled on my naked eyes. And once more, too, did the grunts, snarls, thunks, and wails grow louder. My gut had never been tighter. The dull, groggy fog of recent unconsciousness had fully died now. I could feel my wrists, palms, fingers, but nothing of the rest of my arms. My legs, face, and almost the entirety of the rest of me was still gone. Still so numb that I couldn't even feel pins and needles. I wanted to cry, to break down into terrified sobs, to call for my mom. But no tears came. When the light clicked again, and the first of the alcoves containing Tobias's own work revealed itself, I couldn't help but scream. Threats be damned. The sight of those 3 tortured, twisted souls was too much for me to stay silent.
Please, my precious prize. I don't want to have to ask a third time. Stay silent. Your screams are ruining the mood, the majesty. This is the dry run for you. For our adoring public.
This word, silent, was accompanied by a metallic clang that rattled my vision. The far too distant wails tempered off into near muteness. Inside my mind, the screaming was loud though. Relentless. How I had the comprehension to follow Tobias's spiel, I still don't know.
Good. Thank you. Now, as I was saying, yes, Bramfield. Well, Bramfield was limited in his vision. Paint. Ha! So quaint. Too quaint, too pedestrian. True art needs to have layers, dimensions.
I could barely hear him. My vision swam. My gut desperately trying to find a diaphragm to throw itself against so I could puke. In this alcove was a sculpture that moved, and moaned and whimpered.
Yes, you see, I chose sculpture as my calling, my outlet. Capturing brilliance, capturing genius requires depth, mass, motion. How could I choose any medium other than flesh and steel, Exactly. One could not.
In front of us, suspended from the alcove walls by thick chains, was a rusted circular metal platform about twice the width of a drain cover. From its underside sprouted a thick cone of cogs, gears, valves, and pistons. They hummed and spat and whirred and hissed, shaking the heavy corroded disc so much that the rattling of the chains could be heard, even over the din of machinery. So too could the drooling moans of the 3 poor souls fused to the other side. How they were still living, I could not fathom. I still can't. As is the case for every single one of Tobias's waking nightmares. I have never wanted anything as much as I wanted to shut my eyes in that moment. If you'd have given me a choice between continuing to look or shooting myself, my finger would have been squeezing the trigger before you'd finished your sentence. The pride in the crooning behind me made me somehow even sicker.
As you can see, I experimented with homage in my early work, with tribute, with imitation. Pathetic, in other words. This piece here, An ode to Zarasashael is the only one of my early pieces worth the power keeping it alive. And even then, only barely. Very gauche. A tad melodramatic? Is that the word? Well, what is the past but a slideshow of embarrassment? It was obvious what the mirror-eyed maniac had been referring to when referencing imitation. These poor, once people had been arranged to as best resemble the mouth-eyed man in Bramfield's painting as Tobias possibly could. None of them had any tissue remaining below the chest, although only the central figure retained their entire set of ribs. This poor creature was the most intact of the three, and the only one connected to the rusty disc, which, to my horror, I quickly realized from the scars and burn tissue it had been welded to. The armless torso was writhing on the brown-orange surface. I was again acutely aware of the numbness in my own arms at the sight of the gnarled, scarred stumps at the creature's shoulders. Sadly, and twisted and nightmarish as these observations were, the heads of the three unfortunate souls left little room in my shattering psyche for much else. I had to remove a lot of cranial matter to get the facial position right. I don't know if they're conscious anymore. Not really. Probably better for them that way, though, right? The oddly pitched laugh would have sent a shiver down my spine if I could feel the damn thing. Again, it was horrifically obvious what he meant. He'd removed the eyes, brow, and nose of each of the trio of victims. More or less, the entire upper halves of their heads were gone. Jagged trails of scar tissue ran along the seams where he'd attached them to each other, fusing the remaining two once people to the armless torso. He'd positioned them back to back, so that their jaws jutted out like thick horns as the amalgamated aberration's new brow. Upside-down mouths twitching and drooled where the eyes of the disc torso should have been, their throats bulging at unsurvivable angles on either side of its neck. The three slavering half-skulls met at the center of the sculpture's perverse face. Where they connected sat a sack of membranous skin stuffed to the point of translucency, revealing a mess of pulsing gray brain matter within. The two peripheral figures were somehow even less intact than the pillar torso. Aside from their twisted necks and halved faces, all that remained of them were internal organs hanging in sagging, goiter-like bulges the size of basketballs. These trembling lumps protruded tumor-like from the underneath of each of the central figure's armpits, and it was impossible to tell where the raw flesh of one body ended and the next began. The quivering organ buboes were further connected to the central torso by exposed veins, arteries, and gastrointestinal tubes, merging every biological system of the heaving bodies into a single organic mass. Keeping them alive was tricky, my little prize. This is actually the third iteration of the piece, but here it is, still breathing all these decades later. Marvelous, no? I'm particularly fond of the mechanisms here, even if they are somewhat crude by my current standards. That cone is full of prototypes for gizmos and doodads I still use today. Still, you'll find that out shortly, won't you? Onwards! The seconds between his final word and the click of the alcove light vanishing felt far too long. I had far too much time watching that misshapen, mangled thing that had once been three, writhing and thrashing on its humming baseplate. I could still see it when the darkness washed once more over us. I felt the tiniest flutter of relief when it became clear Tobias didn't intend to show me his entire gallery. We walked through the dark for at least 15 minutes, the ebb and sway of the stinging wind on the flesh of my eyes informing me when we turned corners in the sightless labyrinth. Tobias was chattering along the entire time, but I'll be damned if I could remember what he said now. I wasn't paying much attention. My thoughts were wrapped in the plummeting realization that I was well and truly screwed. It's no secret that I hadn't made the best decisions in life. Truth is, I was probably only a few years from dead.
Some part of me, though, some small part, had always believed I'd sober up and turn my life around at the 11th hour. How long I'd been unconscious for after Tobias hit me with the bat, I don't know. But it was long enough that my last fix was well and truly flushed from my system. I was soberer than I'd been in years. Even then, the irony that I'd found lucidity at the moment shit turned far too late was starting to tear me apart. My inner lamenting was interrupted here and there by dread-stoking noises from the unseen alcoves we passed. Some were barely audible grunts and slavering similar to those made by the tri-mouthed living bust. The deeper into the darkness Tobias took me, the more grotesquely human the sounds became. Grunts became whispers. Slavering evolved into sobs. Once or twice I could hear a rasping, "Help," or "Please, please kill me." Tobias chattered and crooned over the growing racket. I lost count of the number of distinct voices, for lack of a better term. By the time there was another click and my naked eyes once more found light, we must have passed dozens of alcoves at least. I doubt I'd be sane enough to write this if he'd insisted on showing me all of them.
Ah, my little prize. I was particularly excited about showing you this one. It's called What Thoughts Bloom on Yonder Breeze. I know what you're thinking. I was going through a pretentious phase when it came to titles. The work, though, it's one of my best, my little prize. Almost as good as, well, you shall see.
I still can't fathom how a mind as sadistic and twisted as Tobias Keenseal's defines good when it comes to his art. It took my eyes a little while to adjust to the sudden flash of light. But as my vision de-blurred, I could feel a fresh wave of terror building in my misplaced gut. Once more, my heart smashed into its surroundings. And though I could feel my hands, I couldn't move them to clutch my chest and steady it. I now know why, of course. But back then, the reminder of my paralysis only served to intensify the renewed panic born from the sight of Tobias's second exhibited work. There was nothing suspended from the brickwork wall of the alcove this time. This second piece stood freely on the grimy, cracked tiles. The inorganic components consisted of two television-sized cast-iron drums, welded together at an acute angle. From the thin wedge between them rose two thick steel poles. These had been bent and twisted in a spiral, and they almost resembled an abstract tornado or whirlpool that nearly reached the lofty ceiling. The boxes at the cable spiral's base hummed in a similar fashion to the cone hanging from the base of the last sculpture. This vibration ran along the twisted rods, sending cracking blue sparks across the surface of the thing wedged tight between them. This was the part that had my stomach looking for a diaphragm again. The flesh component of Tobias's chosen medium. I'm guessing that it must have been a person once, though how long ago I couldn't say. At first I only knew it was human in origin because of the tufts of gray hair and occasional teeth, finger, and toenail clusters dotted sporadically across its undulating surface.
I was going through a radical experiment phase here, my little prize. Experimenting with diseases, pathogens, cancers. This one was a foray into unchecked growth, into cellular chaos, a mirror of inhumane humanity we've allowed our society's reflection to become. As I said, pretentious. The form, though, my prize, the form is my master-crafted gift to you. To me. To us. Feast your eyes on it and weep as I do.
And Tobias was indeed weeping. I could hear it in his words. I would have been too, although for entirely different reasons. The form Tobias was so proud of, his gift, was a potato-shaped lump of flesh about 10 feet long. It was suspended in the air somehow, rotating slowly as it floated between the steel spirals, riding the crackling faint blue bolts of lightning that jumped from their humming surface. As the thrashing lump turned in place, a few gnarled facial features came into view on its surface. A bloodshot eye near its base, a swollen mouth at its middle, cauliflower ear and a second eye closer to its top. The only thing that stopped me screaming when the bloodshot gaze locked on mine was the morbid curiosity driving me to hear Tobias's explanation, his excuse for the abomination before me. This one, my little prize, is still conscious. And it was at this moment the twisted, swollen mouth on the thing's surface wrenched itself open and screeched at us. Flecks of phlegm burst from between cracked brown teeth. Never before have I heard so much rage, so much anger, so much hatred poured into any sound made by a human mouth. It was like no roar I could ever imagine a human capable of making. It was human, though. Of that I was certain, no matter how much I wish I wasn't. I had no bones I could feel. But if I did, the obvious, still humanness of that otherwise unworldly shrieking would have chilled me to them. Tobias allowed the mouth on the behemoth tumor to carry on shrieking and screaming its unchecked hatred at me, until the gnarled features orbited once more from view. I could hear him tittering to himself as it roared, laughing at the white-hot rage in those bulging, bloodshot eyes. I could do nothing but wilt under the force of that fury. It was clear the fact I wasn't in any way responsible didn't matter one bit to the person that was now this disgusting, heaving mass. The consciousness behind those misshapen eyes was so far into the realms of suffering, it could feel nothing but hatred for anyone that didn't share in its pain.
You see, my little prize, it was this piece, the reaction of the model here, that made me realize what my clay emotionally became was far more important than what it physically became. This lump here, the cancerous nothing, has created beauty from the most base, the most ugly, the most disgustingly passionate depths of the human spectrum. It was upon seeing this recently, and finishing the last piece I want to show you, that, well, you'll see. I'm so excited, my little prize. I honestly can't wait.
We reached the final alcove of our tour after another half-hour walking in total blackness. Tobias must have had the maze engraved in his memory. Either that or his mirror eye could see in the dark, because not once did he get lost or bump into a hidden wall. The sounds from the unlit alcoves reached further and further into my nightmares for inspiration. The whimpers and moans grew to eerie levels of quiet. Soon they became less pained, more subdued. Sobs soon became unintelligible gibbering. Insane ramblings and twisted mutters rose from the dark spaces where whimpers of fear once came. If I could feel my spine, it would have tingled. My absent toes would have curled. I had to convince myself I couldn't hear a machine gun paced tink-tink-tink-tink of flesh against glass that perfectly aligned with my heartbeat. I think I'd have started pleading with Tobias if I hadn't spent the prior few years high off my ass. I started pleading with myself instead, begging myself to let this be some kind of trip, some withdrawal-induced fever dream. Part of me thought I'd died, that I had OD'd and this place was hell. Hell, maybe it is. I can't think of many other places you'd see the kind of fucking thing that was in front of me when the final set of alcove lights went up. It had once been at least 6 people, judging by the number of mouths. I didn't have time to count the eyes, though, and there could very well have been more than a dozen. It was impossible to count the rest of the pieces, but there was definitely more than enough on display to account for 6 people. At least 6. This alcove was larger than the others, wide enough to account for about 3 of the previous ones, and then some. The entire space was taken up by a vast canvas, stretched taut end to end. I could tell straight away what it was made of. There was still blood pumping through the veins in it, obvious scarring marks identical to those on the merged faces of Tobias's first sculpture. The 6 mouths were arranged at the center of the room-sized skin canvas, scar fused into it. The galaxy of eyes spiraled from them, and the sea of blinking gazes was itself surrounded by a fractal ring of twitching ears. Marvelous, isn't it, my little prize? This one I call From the Machine, Man. Keeping this piece breathing, why, well, I'm a miracle worker. A true miracle worker. Look at those lungs, though, my little prize. Look at those hearts still beating. They're one now. All those minds, one in body and soul. That was the message of this piece. That we are all separated only by the physical constraints of our shells. I stared. What else could I do? As Tobias rambled on about his masterwork, I was beyond processing any of what he was saying by this point, really. I wasn't afraid. Terrified, horrified, panicking. None of the synonyms I have for fear cover the levels of it I felt at that moment. If they could move, my eyes would have rolled back in their sockets. The tink, tink, tink that ran in time with my thrashing heartbeat was too loud to ignore now, as was once more the acute awareness that I still couldn't find lungs to draw labored breaths from. The vast canvas was moving. It was pulsing, stretching, heaving as the galaxy of exposed organs spasmed and squeezed. Every part of the people Tobias had used was on display. Hearts, livers, lungs, intestines, brains, bladders, nothing save for bone and muscle had gone to waste. Every exposed organ was fused to the skin canvas. And with each beat of the strategically placed hearts, I could see dark fluids rushing in and out of each of them. They were all, beyond any sense of reason or sanity, still alive. It was when the nexus of eyes stopped rolling chameleon-like to fixate on me that my screams started. When the 6 mouths on the canvas opened and spoke in unison, with a chorus of male and female voices, Tobias had to finally make good on his threats to silence me.
What is this?
The tapestry groaned. Every one of its dozen eyes honed on my immobile ones.
What has he brought us? What has he made? What is... Oh.
What the mouths on the canvas did next, the sound the mouths made when the eyes had finally taken in my entire form, still haunts me. They started laughing, a horrid laugh, a crooked tittering, a harsh, disjointed guffaw that almost drowned out my now unrestrained howls of pure panic. I didn't have long to scream, though. As I said, Tobias made good on his earlier threats. There was a metallic scraping accompanied by the briefest screech of speaker feedback, like an aux jack being pulled from a cheap guitar amp. The second it hit my hearing, the sounds of my screams left. All I could hear now was the cackles of the living canvas and the all-too-clear tink, tink, tinking of vascular muscle on glass. You forced my hand, my little prize. Tobias had to yell to be heard over the hysterics of the flesh wall. So I'm sorry, but no voice for you. Not that it matters much. We're near the end. Our destination. The finale. Home. I'm so... well, gosh. I'm just so excited, my little prize. So excited. We weren't gliding through the dark for long on this final journey. We had also run out of unseen alcoves, although the near silence was hardly a comfort. Tobias wasn't jabbering to himself anymore either. The only sounds I could hear from his direction were his echoing footsteps and breaths. The latter were coming through fast, ragged. His anticipation was palpable. It radiated from him. A razor-wire eagerness only found elsewhere in nature riding the lungs of half-starved predators before a kill. I couldn't feel my breaths. I couldn't feel anything at all except the stinging of my eyes, the knotting of my gut, and the tink, tink, tink of my heart. Against what I prayed were my ribs. Inside my mind, I rolled and roiled in the blind terror that rose the moment Tobias, for lack of better word, disconnected my voice. The acute awareness of every missing sensation magnified 1,000-fold in that moment. An uncountable number of worst-case scenarios flashed past my mind's eye, each more hellish and resolve-breaking than the last. When Tobias clicked on his final light switch, it took me less than half a second to realize that, hellish as they had been, none of my predictions were as bad as the reality that awaited me.
So, with my last piece, from the machine man, I was experimenting with unity, my little prize. Yes, the form is impressive, but the mind, the one from the mini, is the real piece. A hyper-resilient collective consciousness that can peer into the void of cognitive infinity without breaking.
Without warning, he launched himself back into my field of view. Grin stretching ear to ear. White bulb reflection and childlike glee, sparkling in both his organic and metallic eyes.
And you, my little prize, are to be its antithesis, its polar negative. My response to my own creation. With them, I expressed concepts of unity and togetherness. With you, I shall explore the uttermost depths of isolation.
His face was inches from my naked pupils. Once more, I found what parts of me that could were balking at the lack of a visible face and the reflection of his mirrored eye.
Welcome, my little prize. No, my little masterpiece, to the beginning of your contribution to history.
He stepped aside to reveal the alcove that would be my tomb. And for the first time, the full horror of my fate dawned on me. The alcove was a large glass case. Inside it was an elaborate network of devices and machinery that included a keyboard, screen, and a computer tower. They weren't what made me wish I still had lungs to scream. What did that was the hands positioned on wires at the keyboard, ready to type. I didn't want to believe it, but there they were, connected by wires painfully screwed and mashed into still exposed bones. I tried to flex my still tingling fingers, urging the digits in the case to remain still. They didn't. My hands were behind the glass, hooked up to a janky iron box with a radio antenna sticking out the top. I watched them flex and wriggle at my command. I could feel the keyboard beneath my fingertips. My gut was once more trying to find a diaphragm. Not just because of the hands, either. The brain, floating in the small steel bar spiral, was equally responsible.
Yes, you see that? That's you, where you actually are now.
Tobias opened the case and poked the floating brain with his little finger. In an instant, every shred of my awareness became white-hot pain. I was blind, deaf, totally unable to register any physical sensation except agony. The moment Tobias removed the digit, the burning ceased. He cocked an eyebrow. His point proved.
Wireless signal transmission, my little modular masterpiece. Observe.
And this is when the last of my remaining sanity broke. Tobias reached down and picked up one of my eyes. My vision split, the view from my left still fixed on my twitching hands in the case. From my right, everything became a blur.
Observe, my little masterpiece. Observe. From man, the machine.
Tobias hadn't been pushing a wheelchair. He'd been pushing a wheeled surgical trolley, the kind used to transport tools. On it were the last remaining parts of me. Each was connected to a small black box, exactly like the one wired to my hands, bent radio antenna and all. My heart was tink-tink-tinking in a glass jar, hung from a rusted metal plate where a lid should be. I could see my stomach and intestines in a similar, albeit slightly larger, vessel. It was the eyes that were the worst part, though. The last thing I remember before I finally won the war for unconsciousness was Tobias holding them to face each other. They were each stretched across a brass ring no wider than a tennis ball. They too were connected to small cast iron boxes with bent antennas to beam signals to and from my floating brain. Thin hooks had been fed through the raw flesh of my eyeballs. The orbs stretched so much to fit the rig that my pupils were flat, distorted, goat-like. If I had a mouth, I would have never stopped screaming. Sadly, Tobias had ensured I'd never scream again. The last thing he did before switching off the alcove light and leaving me in my tomb was to arrange the small black boxes and jars I'd become. One eye forever faces the screen. It is this, he told me, that's the real art. With nothing to do but type, my remotely operated hands have been letting out a crescendo of, well, of exactly the kind of mad ramblings you'd expect someone in my position to write. My words are projected on the alcove wall behind my case, and the many visitors to Tobias's gallery do so love to titter and chuckle at them. My other eye is facing them, you see. Tobias wants me to see how the patrons react to my descent into madness. That was 5 years ago. 5 years I have been here, unable to do anything except type jabbering lunacy in the hopes that one of the rich, powerful, and publicly known patrons has a pang of guilt and shuts off the machines, somehow keeping me alive. I'd given up hope. That is, until the power surge. It happened this morning. Small, almost too small to notice, but enough to cause the aging desktop tower in my case to restart. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't staring at an infinitely scrolling blank page. I was looking at a desktop display. A desktop display with an internet browser icon clearly in reach. I'm not trying to reach all of you. Most of you, I imagine, are upstanding folk who wouldn't take vague cash-in-hand modeling work. Most of you aren't desperate enough to need to venture into abandoned industrial estates to do whatever is necessary for a scrap of cash. Those of you that are, though, please, heed my warning. If you see an ad like the one I answered, don't follow it up. Do literally anything else. I don't care how hungry you are, how bad you want that fix, or how angry the landlord is getting. Nothing is worth this. I have to wrap this up. I can hear Tobias coming back through the tiny mics in my eye boxes. Please, please, please don't answer his ad. 5 years is a long time. He's made many more creations in that time and never seems to have a shortage of models to work with. Don't let yourself become the next one.